I think when something is too flavorless and shows too much of what's actually happening at all times, it almost feels a little satirical to what the game is like doing.
Distraction makers.
Let's talk about Kicker.
Kicker is a fascinating mechanic.
Kicker is very interesting.
Outside of Magic terms, by the way. I use Kicker in all sorts of game design discussions. If you listen to Mark Rosewater's podcast, which I was top 3% of his listeners this last year. I know. I listened a lot. He talks about Kicker and he talks about cycling a lot, which cycling is also on his top 5. And I was very, I guess I was kind of thrown off with him throwing Kicker onto his top 5 list because the way he kind of talks about Kicker and cycling is how I like to use it in game design terms, which is that it's almost like you're getting too much of a glimpse under the hood of game design.
Right.
And that basically, I think he's phrased this, you've used this phrase too, which is that every single mechanic in Magic is basically just Kicker or cycling.
Right. You pay a cost to either get a stronger effect or an alternative effect to the thing, or you exchange a card for a different card. Right. Cycling could even be compared to tutor spells. Cycling's a really bad tutor
cycling's
spell.
A terrible mechanic then, actually. God, it's probably the worst mechanic in the game.
Nobody ever played cycling.
Nobody ever played cycling
Never played
in Standard.
Never played it.
But so Kicker, that's why I was really interested in hearing his thoughts on Kicker and stuff on his top 5, and it sounded like pretty standard. Like it's a very effective mechanic at fulfilling what it fulfills, which is very basic. It's like, you pay more mana and it does bigger thing.
I think that the two things that are Kicker's biggest drawback is that, it has essentially, it is flavorless. It is the vanilla of keyworded mechanics. But also that, it encapsulates so much design space, that you could almost call anything Kicker.
Well, this prowess is similar in that it's something ends up getting stronger whenever you play a spell. And that essentially is investing mana in order to get outcome, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you have to have the card on top of that, so it makes it slightly more difficult. And so the reason that I prefer that, prowess is still pretty loose flavorfully, it's something, at least it's at least a word that makes sense other than Kicker. But it's a very specific thing that's happening. It's increasing its stats for combat, right?
Right. It's
Kicker is anything.
Anything. Yeah. So I think if we start looking at Kicker in broader scope of game design, we can see it as, okay, you have a card, you have an action that you're trying to take, and do you want to exert more of your resources into that singular thing, right?
Yeah.
You can even look at it in terms of maybe StarCraft or something, right? Where instead of doing something that would be more broad, you're investing in your research into your siege tanks or your roaches or whatever you're doing, right? To make them stronger.
Yeah.
You're investing your resources in something, you're going deep on a strategy instead of wide on a strategy.
Right. And I mean, we've talked about before that the two basic mechanics of any one game is you're either moving towards a win condition or you're investing to move towards the win condition in a greater way.
Right.
And that's essentially what Kicker is. I've seen a lot of people when they first start designing a game, and I've done this for sure, is you get in your head this idea of almost everything should be Kicker in a way, right? Where I think there's a lot of things that you end up designing that there's almost you don't want to have those limitations to it. And so there's always this, you can pay for this thing, but you can also pay for this other thing. And it gets even stronger in that way. But it's in the same way that Kicker is, what I mean by a game kind of showing under the hood a little bit too much is it's kind of almost winking at the player. This is what's happening all the time, and and it's a little too on the nose that it takes. I think when something is too flavorless and shows too much of what's actually happening at all times, it almost feels a little satirical to what the game is doing.
Right.
And you can kind of see some game genres more recently that are doing this. I think a lot of idle games are kind of doing this. It's this sort of like satire winking, like you're really just here to see numbers go up, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think that Kicker kind of gives that same kind of feeling where I'm like, I know what you're doing.
It's right. It's a postmodern mechanic, right?
Yeah.
You're winking at the underlying structures of the game in a way that if you're not careful can creep into that almost parody territory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think Kicker necessarily ends up there, but I do think that what they landed on was something that was really foundational. And since then, I think changing it into things that are more flavorful and more specific has been very good. I think it's also interesting to talk about sort of the decision point that you're giving to players, right? Like we talked about that a little bit already, but what I mean is, you're giving players a choice in variance, right? Like, in this moment, what's the right card for me to have in my hand, right? I have it as the non-kicked version of the card, and I have it as the kicked version of the card. And in this instance, do I want to play it for the non-kicked cost? Like, is that card the card that I need in this moment, or do I need the kicked version? Am I going to hold it for later in the game? Am I going to play it now? And there's a whole lot of interesting decisions that come up based on a card's, I guess, modality. Is that the term? Like, there's a bunch of different ways this card can be utilized.
Right.
And opening up that possibility space in terms of increasing choice variance. And you can play this card one way, you can play it another way. It allows a spell to remain relevant throughout the game, right? Like I was mentioning earlier, so you can play it for its just regular casting cost, or you can play it with its including its kicker cost, and it becomes sort of like, again, a spell that like remains relevant in your hand,
right,
as the game goes on. And I think in those instances, especially in limited, that's very useful in terms of making sure that if a player's drawing a card that's a lower cost card, that it's still relevant late game. There's also some interesting, if we look at, I think we can compare and contrast a little bit this point that we're making that like kind of everything is kicker. If we look at a few other mechanics, I think flashback is actually the perfect one to look at in terms of getting kicker, but with the right flavor, right? Like flashback is kicker in the graveyard, right? Like, and it's called flashback, which is, remembering the past. The graveyard's the past. These things are interesting in terms of like, okay, well, it's a very specific use of kicker that has restrictions, and therefore those restrictions give you evoke a theme. They evoke a feeling.
Right.
And putting the card in its entire package, I think, is something that helps to identify what theme these mechanics are telling. And when all those pieces are together, I think that's when you get something that feels correct, I guess.
Right.
Sometimes with kicker, it never quite reaches that level of correctness, of resonance is usually what I end up calling it.
I mean, I think that I know Mark Rosewater uses this as an example, but I also just think it's a really great example, is that flying is the most intuitive keyword in Magic, in that when someone is taught the game and they look at it and they go, oh, flying, what does that mean? I can fly over, I can't hit you.
Right.
It's almost I've taught people Magic before, and they their brain gets there before I can explain it. And kicker, I feel like you don't quite, you read that and you're like, what does that do? What am I supposed to do with
kind
this?
of connecting those dots, I guess. So, what's funny is I feel like it's close, right? And kicker is you're like, okay, well, what am I do? It feels because kicker is a term outside of Magic design. Here in Oregon, we get this thing called the kicker check, which is you get money back if too many taxes were paid. But it's a bonus, right? It's a kicker. Yeah. We're gonna, and it's okay, you can almost see it in that context, but within the context of what actually is it?
It's a very effective mechanic, but I'm not surprised that Mark Rosewater has flashback as his number one, which is basically just kicker, but with flavor.
Flavor kicker.
Flavor kicker.
Okay, so cycling was created by Richard Garfield.
Who?
I know, right? Oh, Richie.
Richie.
During Tempest.
Oh, what do you know?
Your guess was correct. though it did not premiere in print until Urza's Saga.
Oh, okay.
So apparently it was worked on during Tempest and then wasn't printed till later.
The world wasn't ready
Right.
for old Richie's designs.
Yeah.
His crazy design.
Yeah, so cycling apparently has been in more blocks than any other non-evergreen keyword.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm kind of surprised it's not evergreen at this point.
Yeah, I am too.
Yeah.
Cycling is so interesting because there's so many layers to like how you would want to decide whether or not you're going to cycle a card. Like you could just be in an instance where like, well, I need to make my land drop, so I'm going to cycle this card.
Right.
And I also think that instance of cycling is probably better than having lands that are spells, right? Because like you're not removing all of that variance, right? You are saying like, okay, well, the opportunity here is that I could draw a land and I need a land right now, but it's not guaranteed to be one. So that it still rewards good deck building. But also in that there's so many other layers to when you would want to cycle a card versus when you would want to play a card, right? Based on, the board state, based on your own sort of internal heuristics and just the best heuristics of Magic. In that it gives choice variance again in the same way that Kicker does, except instead of do I want this effect to be more powerful, do I want more of this thing, it's do I want this effect or do I want the potential for whatever that other card could be.
Right. I think that's what throws me off with cycling as opposed to Kicker, is that as a I'm not a new player necessarily, but I'm not like a very skilled player. I never played competitively or anything like that. I am currently ranked silver on Magic Arena.
Mm-hmm.
Not because I can't get higher, but just because I just started playing ranked. Okay. So, like my mono red deck's going places.
Nice.
But I think when I first saw cycling, it was very difficult for me to intuit when I should use this. Whereas Kicker, it gives it to you, right? It's like, do you want this or do you want bigger effect? Cycling is much less intuitive for a new player to understand. And I remember reading it for the first time and I was like, okay, like I see what it's doing, but I don't know if this is good because I think initially it was like the land cycling. And I was like, okay, but I like mana. Why would I get rid of mana, right? And obviously, like, after a while, it realize like, okay, this is why it's good. But
yeah, I mean, it does fall into the same kind of category and problem that we end up seeing in a lot of these games that try to let you play cards in your hand face down as mana, is that like players don't want to discard their cards, right? They want to play their cards. And when you're asking them to discard something for something that they don't know what it's going to be, it's even almost a bigger jump. At least with playing something face down, you know it's going to be a land. Cycling at least isolates that choice to individual cards, and that like, okay, well, if this card happens to have cycling but these other ones don't, right? So if I'm planning to play those cards later, maybe I can cycle this one for a new one. But I do think that, yeah, it is interesting to see it so high on the list when I do think that is a big hurdle to get over for newer players. But potentially it's that this is an ability and a thing that is seen as a stepping stone in understanding higher level play. And in that way, I think it's good and successful, right?
Right.
And there are also cards, too, that give you an effect when they are cycled, right? There's the island cycling or whatever, all the stuff that just came out, in the land cyclers that let you search for a land when you cycle the card. And I think that's... I guess what's funny about that is when you stop and think about, like, okay, well, we have a dual-faced card, right? One side's a spell, one side's a land. It's doing something very similar to what this card is, right? Like, okay, I pay 1 mana, I discard it, I go search my library for a land, and I put it in my hand, and then if I needed to play a land that turn, I can.
Yeah, I think new players, from my memory, view mana like they highly regard mana. Because I think all you have to do is experience mana screw once for you to be like, I never want to not have mana.
Right. I think that it's interesting because part of it is, okay, if I'm looking at it from a tournament optimization perspective, the land cyclers end up being better than a card that's like, this can be a spell or a land, because I'm removing that a card from my deck, which lowers my variance. I'm more likely to draw other cards if I do that. But the spells... I'm trying to think about it in terms of like what play decision making, does the cycling equal more decision making or less decision making in terms of like, okay, well the spell in my like I guess what I'm saying is when you have a land like a dual faced land spell card, right, where it's a spell on the back and it's a land on the front. That to me is weighting those two things equally, or at least fairly equally in terms of like, well, it has a face and has a back technically, but I think that the experience a player has when they look at that card is this spell is either a land or a spell. But with cycling, I feel like the new player perspective or whatever when they look at a card is that this is whatever this card is first, and the cycling part of it is second.
Yeah.
And I think that's powerful. I think communicating that hierarchy of information in a different way is really useful to show like a new player that, okay, well, this is what this spell is sort of intended to be, but it also could be cycled for a land.
Okay.
Where the spell that is a land on the front and a spell on the back, to me, that's just like less clear about that card's intention. It's sort of like it's both of these things, but only one of them.
Yeah.
But what's funny about the land cyclers in particular is that when you're sort of in advanced play for those cards, they basically only get played for the cycling. You're usually doing something kind of degenerate or whatever, where you're going to cycle them into your graveyard, and then you're going to play, Cascade spell that gets you into Living End or whatever, and then all your stuff's going to come back from your graveyard, and so you're just using it to fix your mana and also dump bodies in the graveyard that eventually just end up on the battlefield. And so it's weird, right? It's weird to like look at those cards in that way and try to see it from like a new player perspective in terms of like, what is the information hierarchy here?
Yeah.
And how are these two cards that are doing very similar things, but how are they different?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I think cycling at least is more intuitive because I prefer having all the information just like you said, like on the card. I do think the hierarchy of it is really nice, but on top of that, it's just that is all the information.
Right. Yeah, it's not on the front and the back.
Right.
Of the card.
Right.
Yeah,
you don't have to like put it under the table and like slide it out of the sleeve.
You're like, what's on the back again? Yeah.
I don't have a transform card.
Yeah.
But one thing that you did mention that I think is very important because it extends to a lot of other aspects of game design, but also of TCG design, which is that players want to play their cards. They don't often want to discard their cards.
Yeah.
And for those that don't believe us, Mark Rosewater himself, who was on the design team for Duel Masters, which is the first card game, as far as I know, that created the system where you can use cards from hand, any card from hand, as mana, said that in their testing, they noticed that most people were disappointed because early on, you would have to play your big person in order to, as mana, in order to play your small person. And especially for a game that is for a younger audience, that isn't intuitive. Now, most of the younger audience doesn't care that much because they're not competitive, but then competitive players are like, well, great, I don't get to play my big thing that I really wanted to play, so it still bums you out either way, right? And it's just not intuitive in that way, and it's kind of a bummer. And that's why I don't like cycling.
Yeah.
I don't like it from such a casual standpoint that I can look at it and be like, yeah, I can absolutely see the competitive viability of this mechanic. But I look at it and I'm like, I don't want to play my card.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's like the skill growth part of it, I think. That's like, okay, sometimes maybe any other card might be better than this card. And I think maybe if you end up in a situation in a game where you're like, okay, I'm basically dead here, but I can cycle this card.
Yeah. It's been very interesting because in my own personal growth of trying to get better at Magic, I've been playing mono red aggro in standard, and something that I have noticed, I don't even know if cycling lands is like currently in the current.
I doubt it.
Yeah, but like I've gotten other cards that are similar in this way. Usually, it's like having like a blood token or something where you discard a card and then you draw a card. So it's basically anything has cycling if you pay 1 mana and have a blood token.
Right.
And the one learning curve that I've been having is, okay, if I'm playing mono red aggro And, depending on where the game is at, if I've got 4 mana, is that enough mana right now? And do I play a land this turn, or would I rather get rid of this land to cycle for something else?
Yeah.
And I think that has been like a turning point in my skill, is being able to identify that and understand, like, what is my deck trying to do to function, and what is the ideal mana that I need in order to win in the next turn or next couple of turns. And if I have to discard a land to do that, then great. And that's where I think cycling, is like, it makes you feel real smart when it all clicks.
You're like, I wish that this, whatever this is in my hand, was 3 damage.
Yeah. And then you turn it around and you go,
it's 3 damage on the back. There it is.